Steep rocky mountains, treacherous canyons, lush river valleys, narrowly winding steel rails, and quaint old steam locomotives that date back to the late 1800s. Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Train Talk. With that introduction, this video's subject can only be the narrow gauge rail lines of the Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad. Prior to the 1920s, it was known as the Denver and Rio Grande, but more on that later. This is an endlessly fascinating subject to me, as these are some of my favorite railroad lines ever built. They have such a rich history that the subject could make up an entire series of videos on its own. For this introductory video, we are going to go through a general overview of the Denver and Rio Grande narrow gauge, exploring everything from the railroad's history to a summary of most of the major lines that comprise the narrow gauge system, as well as a look at some of the different equipment that was used over the railroad. We'll also be taking a brief glance at the Rio Grande Southern Railroad, which was under the control of the Denver and Rio Grande for almost all of its existence. Now let's dive into the Rio Grande narrow gauge. Before we get too far into the history of the railroads themselves, I have to give a brief introduction to the term narrow gauge. For those not familiar, gauge is a term in railroading that refers to the distance or width between the rails of a railroad. In North America, as well as many other countries around the world, the normal or standard gauge of track was and still is 4 feet 8.5 inches. Narrow gauge refers to anything narrower than this, and broad gauge to anything wider. There are also some sections of railroad that can accommodate two different gauges of trains by having one common rail on one side and then two separate rails on the other, each for one of the two gauges. This arrangement is called dual gauge. In the early days of railroading, back in the 1800s, many different railroads used different track gauges. It wasn't long before a standard was agreed on in order to build railroads that had the ability to interchange cars from one to another. However, this practice did not catch on everywhere. In many mountainous areas, the terrain was so rugged that building a standard gauge railroad seemed impractical. Narrow gauge railroads could be built over much rougher terrain with steeper grades, tighter curves, and at a lower overall cost than standard gauge railroads. Because of this, narrow gauge railroads were adopted for many industrial purposes where interchange with other railroads wasn't as important. It was also heavily employed in mountainous terrain, particularly in the western United States. While a few different narrow gauges were used, by far the most common was 3-foot gauge, becoming the standard narrow gauge, so to speak. So you may be thinking, gee Mike, that's all well and good, but there were lots of neat old narrow gauge railroads all over the western United States. Why care so much about the Rio Grande? Well, there are a few reasons why so many people have an interest in the Denver and Rio Grande. For one, two large sections of original D&RG Railroad are preserved and operate today as tourist heritage railways. These railroads were also critical in developing the economies of both Colorado and New Mexico during the late 1800s and into the 1900s, particularly as it related to the mining industry. But for a lot of enthusiasts, the interest goes further than that. The stories of both the Denver and Rio Grande and the Rio Grande Southern were filled with hardship throughout most of their existence, and yet they managed to hold on for a very long time with the often minimal resources they had. It is the story of an amazing and unlikely survival in many ways. While most narrow gauge railroads in North America had played out by the early to mid 1900s, the Rio Grande was still hauling steam-powered revenue freight through the mountains of southwestern Colorado and northern New Mexico as late as 1968. Speaking of steam, the Rio Grande Southern and the Denver and Rio Grande both had quite an interesting fleet of steam locomotives and other equipment. Some of the very classic-looking, small steam locomotives of the D&RG that were built in the late 1800s were still in service into the early 1950s. And last but not least, the terrain that many of these rail lines passed through was nothing short of magnificent. In fact, many say that the scenery on some of these narrow gauge rail lines, but particularly that of the Rio Grande Southern, was some of the most spectacular of any railway anywhere in the world. And it is with this background that we set the stage for our story on the Rio Grande narrow gauge. The Denver and Rio Grande, or D&RG for short, was chartered by William Jackson Palmer in 1870. His goal was to build a railroad that would stretch from Denver, Colorado all the way to the US-Mexico border. The first section of line was constructed from Denver to Colorado Springs, Colorado. Soon, Palmer and the DRG found themselves at odds with the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway over the rights to build through Raton Pass in order to bring his railroad south into New Mexico and closer to the border. Eventually, the Santa Fe built south over Raton, and Palmer built west through the Rocky Mountains with his sights on reaching the Pacific Ocean. The original main line of the DNRG stretched along the Arkansas River from Pueblo, Colorado, into Salida and then up over Marshall Pass into Gunnison, through the Black Canyon to Montrose, and then finally north along the Gunnison River into Grand Junction, Colorado. Eventually, the railroad would extend all the way from Denver to Salt Lake City with a new main line heading north from Salida over Tennessee Pass and then along the Colorado River through Glenwood Canyon as a more direct way of reaching Grand Junction. This main line from Denver over Tennessee Pass to Salt Lake City was eventually converted to standard gauge. Palmer's railroad never reached Mexico, nor did it arrive at the shores of the Pacific Ocean. However, he did realize the economic potential of tapping into the agricultural region of south-central Colorado and the mining activity in southwestern Colorado. So, he built his railroad over La Veta Pass into the San Luis Valley and then all the way to Durango, Colorado by the early 1880s. About a decade later, another famed narrow-gauge railroad was about to get its start. A toll road builder by the name of Otto Mears decided that he would build a railway from Durango to Ridgway, Colorado along the western face of the San Juan Range of the Rocky Mountains. His goal was to tap the numerous mines in the area, particularly those located in the mountains to the north and west of Silverton, Colorado. In 1891, the Rio Grande Southern was officially open for business. So what lines comprise the Rio Grande narrow gauge? While the entire Denver and Rio Grande system was initially built as 3-foot narrow gauge, most of this was upgraded to standard gauge. The network of rail lines that most think of when referring to the narrow gauge are all located in the southwestern portion of the state of Colorado and northern New Mexico. With only a couple of exceptions, these lines remained as narrow gauge for their entire existence. The portions of the Denver and Rio Grande narrow gauge, when combined with the Rio Grande Southern on the western edge, create what was sometimes referred to as the narrow gauge circle, forming a several hundred-mile-long complete loop of track through Colorado and New Mexico. So large was this system that it would come to be the largest narrow gauge network in the United States. In order to better appreciate this vast array of narrow gauge rail lines, let's break the system down into its most critical components. On the northern edge of the circle, the Black Canyon and Marshall Pass routes of the Gunnison Division traveled nearly 150 miles between Montrose and Salida, Colorado by way of the Gunnison River's scenic Black Canyon, Saponaro, Gunnison, and the formidable Marshall Pass. As previously mentioned, this was part of the original Denver and Rio Grande mainline between Denver and Salt Lake, completed in 1882. Salida in the east was the major connection point between the narrow gauge and the standard gauge main line over Tennessee Pass. The west end of the Gunnison Division at Montrose also served as a connection between the standard and narrow gauges, with the standard gauge branch line continuing north to Grand Junction. Forming the eastern side of the narrow gauge system was the Valley Line, traveling approximately 75 miles from Mears Junction just outside of Salida, south over Poncha Pass, and then straight as an arrow down the San Luis Valley and into Alamosa, Colorado. Completed in 1890, a short section of this line was converted to dual gauge use in 1930. The southern leg of the circle was made up by the San Juan Extension, stretching 200 miles along the border of Colorado and New Mexico as it traveled between Alamosa and Durango. Along the way, the route passed through Antonito, over the steep Cumbres Pass, then through Chama and Dulce, New Mexico, and Bayfield, Colorado. The line was completed in 1881. Alamosa served as the main shop complex for the narrow gauge, where all heavy repairs were made. It should be noted that the San Juan extension also included the section of rail line in between Pueblo, Colorado and Alamosa, although this section was converted to standard gauge fairly early on. As such, Alamosa was a third connection point between the standard and narrow gauge. The rest of the San Juan Extension's right-of-way from Alamosa to Durango was also built to standard gauge specifications, in case the Rio Grande ever decided to convert the rest of the line to standard gauge. Despite this, the Antonito to Durango section was never upgraded. Only a short section from Alamosa to Antonito was modified for dual-gauge use. Last but not least, the 1891 built Rio Grande Southern Railroad and the Denver and Rio Grande Ouray branch made up the western edge of the circle. The Rio Grande Southern traveled from Durango up the western face of the San Juan Mountains through Dolores, Vance Junction, over Dallas Divide and into Ridgeway, 160 miles in all. At Ridgeway, the RGS met the Denver and Rio Grande Ouray branch, which connected Montrose and Ouray by way of Ridgeway, a total distance of 35 miles. The Ouray branch was constructed in 1887. And so went the narrow gauge circle. All of these lines were built between 1880 and 1891, and most would last up until the early to mid-1950s. A number of branch lines came off the narrow gauge to access various cities and industries. 3 major branch lines were built off the San Juan extension. In 1880, during the building of the San Juan extension, construction commenced on a line from Antonito south towards Santa Fe, New Mexico. While the intent of this line was to reach Albuquerque, New Mexico, and possibly El Paso, Texas, as a way of accessing the U.S.-Mexico border, it never went any further than the 120 or so miles from Antonito to Santa Fe. After some delays due to financial hardships, the branch was finally completed in 1887, eventually being referred to as the Chili Line after the chili peppers that were popular in the region. The 45-mile-long Silverton branch opened in 1882, running from Durango north along the Animas River to the many mines located in and around Silverton, Colorado. The 47-mile-long Farmington branch was built significantly later in 1905 and was originally constructed as standard gauge but later converted to narrow gauge as it was completely isolated from the rest of the standard gauge system. It traveled from Durango southward to Farmington, New Mexico, tapping the farms and later oil fields in the area. The Denver and Rio Grande Southern profited handsomely from the mining economy in southwestern Colorado. That all came to an end with the Silver Panic of 1893. There were a few contributing factors to this economic depression. However, the most significant was the U.S. Congress repealing the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, which had required the United States government to purchase a greater amount of silver each year. By repealing the act, which had artificially bolstered the economy, the demand for silver drastically decreased. As a result, the bottom fell out of the market for silver, and overnight, prices plummeted, thus rendering mining of silver unprofitable. This devastated the region economically, and the railroads were no exception. Particularly hit hard was the Rio Grande Southern, which was only in its 3rd year of operation at the time. The RGS would never fully recover from the Silver Panic. It was placed into receivership under the control of the Denver and Rio Grande, remaining under D&RG control for the rest of its existence. The D&RG would undergo financial hardships of its own, both related and unrelated to the Silver Panic. A large corporate reorganization in the early 1920s resulted in the railroad being renamed from the Denver and Rio Grande to the Denver and Rio Grande Western. In the aftermath of the Silver Panic, both railroads turned to other sources of freight revenue. Agricultural products and livestock became a significant source of revenue early on. The railroads were also used to haul many raw materials, including lumber, coal, limestone, and eventually crude oil. This supplemental business would greatly help the Denver and Rio Grande. While the Rio Grande Southern also benefited from some of this same additional traffic, the railroad was faced with repair costs from a series of rock slides and floods. To mitigate these expenses, the RGS looked to cut some corners wherever they could to save money, often resulting in overgrown railroad rights-of-way and somewhat dilapidated-looking equipment. Winter snow would pose a different sort of challenge to the railroads. Marshall Pass and Cumbres Pass were both over 10,000 feet in elevation, and Poncha Pass wasn't that far behind. Keeping the lines cleared and the trains moving in the winter was a constant struggle, and snow could even be found in the mountains as late in the year as June. Different snow fighting strategies were attempted, but the most successful method of snow removal was the rotary snowplow. These machines had large, round, steam-powered rotary blades that would spin in a circle, slicing through snow and throwing it off the track to clear the line. Still, this was a slow, costly process. The rotary was not self-propelled and needed to be pushed by a series of locomotives, each with a different crew. In the beginning, when the locomotives were small, upwards of a dozen engines were called on occasion to power the plow through the drifts. Later in existence, the Rio Grande would even close the line over Cumbres Pass for several months of the year, as it was deemed not worth the expense nor the difficulty of keeping the line open to run the trains. We've spent a lot of time talking about the history of individual rail lines, so now it's finally time to look at the steam locomotives that called these railroads home. In the early years, the Denver and Rio Grande started off with small 240 wheel arrangement locomotives intended for passenger service and 260 wheel arrangement locomotives known as moguls for freight. These were soon supplemented with 440 American types. All were built to burn coal. Not even 10 years into the railroad's existence, it was clear that larger motive power would be needed. Several 280 consolidation types were purchased from the Baldwin Locomotive Works, among other locomotive builders, throughout the late 1870s and into the 1880s. These would be used for hauling freight and in helper service over the many steep passes on the narrow gauge system. During the same time, a fleet of 460 10-wheelers was also purchased. These locomotives had bigger drive wheels than most other narrow gauge locomotives and were thus intended for passenger service. Before we go any further, let's take a look at the Denver and Rio Grande locomotive class or type designations. At first, the railroad designated locomotives based on overall weight. Class 70 consolidations weighed in at 70,000 pounds. Following corporate reorganization, locomotive class designations went by the rated locomotive tractive effort and a single letter identifying the locomotive wheel arrangement. T was used for 10-wheeler, C for consolidation, and eventually K for Mikado. For instance, the Class 70 became the C19, a consolidation with around 19,000 pounds of tractive effort. In the 1900s, the railroad would begin to replace a number of the, by then several decades old, consolidation locomotives with 282 Mikados. These locomotives were built with an outside frame. As the name implies, outside frame locomotives feature a frame that runs along the outside of the driving wheels as opposed to behind them. This was a departure from the vast majority of steam locomotives that were built for North American railroads, but a practice that was becoming more and more common with the narrow gauge railroads of the time. By using an outside frame, a larger, more powerful locomotive could be built because the design was not as constrained by the 3-foot narrow gauge track. The outside frame design locomotives featured large characteristic counterweights that would balance the side rods. As these locomotives were quite a bit wider than the 3-foot gauge track, they often developed a bit of a rocking movement as they would travel along. The first batch of these outside frame 282 locomotives, later designated as Class K27, arrived in 1903 and quickly gained the nickname of Mudhens because of the apparent waddling motion as they rolled down the track. 3 different classes of these 282 locomotives were built, with a fourth, dubbed Class K37, being converted in-house by the Rio Grande in the late 1920s from standard gauge 280 locomotives. With the arrival of the Mikados, the consolidations that had not been scrapped up to that point would continue to work as yard switchers, in helper service, and as main power on some of the smaller branch lines into the 1950s. The Mikados would remain as the primary power for the railroad throughout the rest of its existence. Most of the Denver and Rio Grande equipment was ordered brand new from the factory. By contrast, just about everything purchased by the Rio Grande Southern was acquired second-hand, often from the D&RG. The Rio Grande Southern bought the D&RG's old 440s when they were being replaced by 280s, and then later purchased these same 280s when the D&RG replaced them with 282s. Additionally, the Rio Grande Southern acquired a small number of 460 10-wheelers from the shuttered Florence and Cripple Creek Railroad after that line failed in the second decade of the 1900s. Later on, the Rio Grande Southern also leased and purchased several of the early K27 class 282s from the Denver and Rio Grande Western. Following the Great Depression, the cash-poor Rio Grande Southern sought innovative ways to save money on some of the lighter load trips that didn't warrant a steam engine and entire train. The railroad's mechanical department came up with an idea for a self-propelled rail car. This took the form of an old automobile body and freight box that were attached to a new frame, creating what the railroad referred to as motors. While not officially recognized by the railroad until later years, many called these cars the galloping geese, derived from the combination of the waddling characteristics of the vehicles as well as their honking horns rather than the more accustomed steam whistles of the time. The motor car project was a success, and this arguably prolonged the railroad's life for many years more than it would have survived otherwise. In all, 7 different motors were built by the railroad, with the initial one later recycled for parts. As traffic continued to dwindle on the Denver and Rio Grande Western, the narrow gauge was faced with the potential prospect of abandonment. Competition created by vast new highway construction in the region posed an existential threat. However, a slight reprieve came for both railroads in the 1940s with the entry of a new business: tourism. At this time, old Western movies were all the rage in Hollywood, and several films were shot on the narrow gauge because of its quaint trains and rugged, untamed scenery from another time. Public interest was generated from these films, and soon sightseers were flocking to southwestern Colorado to ride the Silverton train from Durango to Silverton on the Rio Grande. The Rio Grande Southern also capitalized off of the tourism business, using its custom-built motor cars, rebranded as the Galloping Goose Fleet, to haul tourists through the Rockies. Tourism began to grow for the RGS, but the blow of losing the U.S. mail contract in 1949 was just too much for the little railroad to handle. The last trains ran in the fall of 1951, and the railroad was torn up for scrap beginning the following year. Over on the D&RGW, things were not looking much better. Hollywood tourism business may have brought some increased passenger traffic to the Silverton branch, but the rest of the system continued to struggle. The Chili line was one of the first to be abandoned, closing for business in 1941. In 1949, the Rio Grande abandoned the main line between Montrose and Gunnison through Black Canyon. Just 4 years later, in 1953, the line through Marshall Pass was also torn up. At this point, the San Juan extension was the last major narrow-gauge rail line to survive. Regular passenger service over the route ended in 1951 with the cancellation of the Alamosa to Durango San Juan Express, but the Rio Grande still held on to some freight business in the form of crude oil shipments from Farmington and Chama. The railroad would continue to be supported by the crude oil boom in Farmington all the way into the early 1960s, when it was contracted to haul materials from Alamosa to Farmington to construct a new pipeline. However, this was only temporary. By the mid-1960s, hardly any through freight was handled over the San Juan extension. 1968 would be the last year of the rail line, with the final revenue freight train running in August of that year. Abandonment and scrapping of this last surviving section of the narrow-gauge freight railroad began in 1970. The era of the Rio Grande narrow gauge had come to a close. Or had it? While the days of the narrow gauge circle are gone and most of the rail lines long ago torn up, you can still hear the sound of steam whistles echoing through the Rocky Mountains. The Rio Grande had attempted several times to abandon the Silverton branch in the 1960s and 1970s, but were not granted permission by the federal government due to the lack of roads reaching to Silverton and the sustained passenger ridership. Finally, the Rio Grande was able to get out from under its narrow-gauge trains in 1980 when the Silverton branch was sold to Charles Bradshaw, becoming the Durango and Silverton Narrow-Gauge Railroad. The Durango and Silverton continues year-round steam tourist trains today, running the same cars and locomotives over the same rail lines they've been traveling on since 1881. Ownership of the line is now in the hands of Al Harper and American Heritage Railways. As amazing as it is that the Durango and Silverton is still in operation, it was not the only section of the Denver and Rio Grande narrow gauge to survive. In 1969, when the Rio Grande was in the process of filing for abandonment of the San Juan extension between Antonito and Durango, the states of New Mexico and Colorado stepped in to save a portion of the railroad. A 64-mile-long segment from Chama, New Mexico to Antonito, Colorado was preserved, opening as the Cumbres and Toltec Scenic Railroad in 1971 under joint ownership by Colorado and New Mexico. Passenger trains are run daily over the railroad from Memorial Day weekend through mid-October. The railroad also features one of the largest collections of preserved freight cars of any railroad in the world. In addition to these two magnificent tourist railroads, several pieces of rolling stock, structures, and other relics from the Denver and Rio Grande and the Rio Grande Southern have survived into preservation. 2 steam locomotives, several passenger and freight cars, and Galloping Goose No. 3 all survive and operate at Knott's Berry Farm Theme Park in Southern California. 2 different museums in Dolores and Ridgway, Colorado feature equipment from the Rio Grande Southern. There are even some old railroad bridges that not only still stand, but have been restored. Among these are a Rio Grande Southern wooden trestle near Trout Lake, and a Denver and Rio Grande steel truss span in the Black Canyon near Cimarron, Colorado, featuring a display with restored locomotive 278, a boxcar, and a caboose. There are other pieces of equipment and structures scattered throughout the West. One of the best collections of vintage Rio Grande Railroad equipment can be found at the Colorado Railroad Museum in Golden, Colorado. Several steam locomotives, including 3 that operate, passenger cars, freight cars, and 3 of the Rio Grande Southern Galloping Geese can all be found on the museum grounds. So that brings us to the end of our journey. 2 amazing railroads with an incredibly rich history, 2 preserved rail lines, and scores of vintage rail cars and locomotives that survive into the present day. Without the Rio Grande, Colorado and New Mexico would not be what they are today. The railroads played a key role in the development of these states from very early on. Today, they continue to shape history as mementos of their existence teach new generations about the role of railroads throughout the Montane West. I hope you enjoyed our look at the Rio Grande narrow gauge. If you enjoyed this video or would like to see more episodes of Train Talk on this subject in the future, be sure to let me know in the comments down below. Also, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for new video notifications. You can find even more train and railroad themed content on my other social media pages. And finally, every Friday at 9 a.m. Pacific Time, there's another railroad themed adventure headed your way right here on the YouTube channel. That's it for now. Until next time, I'm Mike Armstrong. I'll see you down the line. Thanks for watching.